Welcome to the Ryan Research Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Ryan, and I am joined today by Ryan Whitton, who is a analyst who's looking at a lot of different things when it comes to industrial policy and economics. And it's a really fruitful conversation that I hope we have. So, Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Great. Can you give a quick summary of your biography and things you're working on?
Yeah, sure. So I guess, professional background is as a market research analyst, kind of slash consultant, primarily in the robotics industry, and more broadly in industrial automation. And I kind of got interested in industrial policy, energy policy, and things related to that. And then I joined a rather sort of quirky boutique company called Bismarck Analysis in 2021, which is set up by my boss, Sam Oboya, uh, and it essentially looks at a lot of these, topics through the lens of great power, great founder theory. And the view here is that, things like energy policy or industrial policy are not necessarily just about technologies or about macroeconomic policy, but about the institutions and founders that drive them. And so that's really been the foundation of my research for the last 2 years or so, looking at institutions and industries. So, for example, our latest Bismarck brief that came out this week was related to Bechtel, which is a private family-owned corporation in the United States, which has become very well known for developing really extensive infrastructure. So just outside my window, you can see the Channel Tunnel that connects Britain to France. That was built by Bechtel. They built Jubail City, which manages the petrochemical industry in Saudi Arabia, and they built the Hoover Dam as well. And I think it's very noteworthy that these very sophisticated, complicated infrastructure projects are very often led by either state corporations or by families. Besides working for Bismarck, I also do a bit of independent research, which tends to be more related to Britain. And there I'm generally looking at three main topics, which is energy, uh, British industry or lack thereof, and within a sort of smaller context, British robotics and that industry. So it's a fairly eclectic things, a number of things that I research, but that's the simple version.
Yeah, very, very fascinating. So, when you're looking at sort of the great founder theory, and then you got into, it's usually these family companies or state enterprises, how does that complicate a popular narrative of sort of a neoliberal version of sort of the plucky startup founder?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think fundamentally, we do believe in the plucky startup founder, but uh, it's not very often. You know, they don't come out of the ether, and it isn't down to some plucky individual. They build institutions, and their exceptionalism, if we're thinking about someone like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, is within not just the technology that they're driving forward, but in the institutions they create. And whether those institutions survive and thrive or stagnate is ultimately the base of our analysis. So yeah, in the United States, it's very noteworthy that publicly traded, professionalized bureaucratic companies are considered the staple of the economy, right? Whether it's the upper heights of U.S. finance, BlackRock, Blackstone. These are all sort of hyper bureaucratized, professional, publicly traded organizations. And then with something like Google, uh, while it is publicly traded, it's still majority owned by the original founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. who sort of lead it in a highly personalized manner and then have tried to at various times offload it to sort of professional career management bureaucrats, essentially, first to Eric Schmidt and then to Sundar Pichai. Um, in Europe, I think there are some, and Asia to an extent, there are some distinctions with the US model. I think the prevalence of family owned corporations is much larger in both Europe and East Asia. People tend to talk about the kairetsu or the chaebols in Japan and Korea, respectively. But in Europe, in particular, the presence of like family-owned industrial foundations is really prevalent, and in some cases more prevalent than in the East Asian economies. I think the Wallenbergs in Sweden are the best case study for that.
And what do these different models provide in terms of takeaways and lessons for economic policymakers of, the American, the Korean, the Japan, the German, Sweden? What are sort of these abstracted principles from each?
Yeah. So that's that's an interesting question. If I think about Sweden, right, like the country sort of overtly presents itself as a social democracy in which you have sort of a very egalitarian tax system in which income is heavily taxed across the board. And there's comparatively little variation in income tax levels between different groups. So, at least on the face of it, you have a more egalitarian society and you have a very large welfare payment system. But Sweden also has no inheritance tax. It has a much more generous wealth tax than, say, somewhere like the UK, and probably to some extent the US as well. And it has very little in the way of new elites that generally come up like through, just starting a new company. Daniel Ek of Spotify would probably be a bit of an exception. The vast majority of wealth in Sweden is monopolized by no more than about 10 or 14 families who control the vast majority of valued stock in the country. The Wallenbergs, depending on what estimate you used, have, essentially owned between 14% and 40% of the country's stock at various points in its history. And so I think what you have there is a model that is far more restrictive in terms of the new elites that can rise to the top, but the elites that do exist, depending on their ability to perpetuate themselves, act as benefactors to the Swedish state and essentially act as a kind of an industrial aristocracy funding a social democracy. And this is not generally overtly talked about in Sweden. It's not presented to the world in this fashion, but this is how many European countries essentially operate. And as Europe gets older and as its welfare payments get more strained, um, that relationship is going to, I think, be interesting to look at.
Do you think that these types of models have to do with different perspectives on industrialization and sort of this modern service economies, where we see there's distinctions between, let's say, America and Germany is in Japan or South Korea, are like very good dichotomies of models that really emphasize industrialization, and like in America and the UK, models that emphasize deindustrialization.
Yeah, I'm not sure to what extent America sort of emphasizes deindustrialization. I think in the UK that point is more true, right? So the US, I mean, the simplification is that the Anglophone countries have had an accelerated deindustrialization versus the European economies, right? So Britain, Canada, America, Australia, they all saw manufacturing decline to somewhere around 12 to 9% of GDP. Um, uh, I think that's right. And in Europe, particularly in relation to Germany, uh, the manufacturing sector was protected to a far greater degree, both formally and informally. And so you got this massive differentiation during the China shock of the 2000s, where manufacturing absolutely fell off a cliff in terms of employment in Britain, fell on by almost 50%, but the China shock was much less pronounced in Germany. There was still a reduction in overall manufacturing employment, um, but it was far more muted. Uh, I think, in the United States, I think it's more complicated, right? Yes, in the US, you did have uh, people who sort of made frivolous assessments that computer chips and potato chips, there was no fundamental difference. But the US has always had very powerful lobbies related to the aerospace sector or to its own automotive sector, which have, in various ways, been able to push through kind of very sort of limited forms of protectionism um, to protect their industries. And what's more, I think the US, perhaps by virtue of its toleration for new elites, has brought in people like Elon Musk who have developed new supply chains and new markets to a degree. So I think if there were to be a direct comparison, it would be um, the British economy sort of versus the European economies. Um, I think deindustrialization and the simplification of the economy in Britain has been sort of a very pronounced trend for really since the 1980s.
And what trends, factors, individuals do you hold most responsible for that deindustrialization in the UK? Whether it was deliberate or was more of a mechanical, indirect way that took its course.
Yeah. So yeah, pushing. Yeah. So if we're talking about individuals, there's no doubt in the 1980s, Britain has a fairly uh, still a fairly strong industrial base, but it has a number of fairly poorly performing publicly owned assets. Um, you then have the discovery of North Sea oil and gas, which creates a somewhat significant setback to UK manufacturing exporters because it raises the price of sterling. So there was, I think, at this point a push for privatization, and this is obviously led by the Thatcher government, uh, and this is not managed necessarily very well. There were lots of proposals in place to try and use North Sea oil in a more strategic way. There was talk as far back as the 1970s in setting up a sovereign wealth fund, something similar to what Norway has now. But that really failed for a variety of reasons. I don't think you can really minimize the role of the Treasury in stopping that. Sovereign wealth funds are kind of an interesting uh, tool of statecraft. Generally, powerful executives love them, right? China has a very extensive sovereign wealth fund. Uh, the Public Investment Fund in Saudi Arabia, uh, which was set up or at least turbocharged by Mohammed bin Salman, uh, doesn't really function like a sovereign wealth fund, but rather as a kind of an alternative state which bypasses the Ministry of Finance and overrides the sort of entrenched interests of, say, Saudi Aramco, and essentially allows this new regime to exert itself on traditional centers of power within Saudi Arabia. For that reason, traditional centers of power like finance ministries or the Treasury in the UK generally dislike sovereign wealth funds. They don't like the idea of executives having access to funding outside of the national budget. And I think that was always a big reason for opposition to sovereign wealth funds as they were first proposed in the 1970s when North Sea oil production really kicked off. And in the 1980s, I think the funds that were used by North Sea oil were generally geared towards funding uh, privatization, as opposed to being used in a more strategic manner. At the time, all the incentives pointed towards that. And while I think deindustrialization is in this country commonly associated with Thatcherism, it's really kind of towards the late 90s and with the ascension of Blair, where you see the biggest drop off in manufacturing employment. I think what you have is kind of a confluence of events. You have the China shock, which really has a huge deflationary impact on the wider world economy. It massively increases the access to cheap Chinese consumer and manufacturing goods. And this is obviously not challenged really in the US or the UK. Maybe you could speak more as to whether it was challenged effectively in Ireland. But you have that. New Labour inherits a very uh, good situation when it comes to electricity prices and UK energy infrastructure. Um, but while there were certainly plans to build new nuclear plants, uh, those did not really get off the ground. And so around 2010, you're kind of in a position where the UK is beginning to get quite significant deficits in energy production, increased electricity costs, uh, and a much less competitive manufacturing sector. So, come 2008, when the global financial crisis comes, Britain's already in quite a bad way. I think, to be fair to the two regimes that I previously talked about, the current Conservative government, which is in some weird way a continuation of the Cameron government of 2010, really just exacerbated the problems. You have what I think is an unprecedented increase in the price of electricity, especially for industrial consumers. And this is really tied towards the failure to build nuclear power plants on time, uh, the stagnation of the oil and gas industry, uh, the kind of very tepid subsidies for solar power, which was quickly sort of taken away, which means that British solar development has actually pretty much fallen flat for the last few years. Um, and then the wholesale sort of push towards offshore wind energy, which has obviously lots of hidden costs, which has played a significant part in making uh, British energy quite uncompetitive versus Europe and certainly versus the United States.
Yeah, that fascinating portrayal that you just laid out there. So now we're caught up to the present history, and so you mentioned the offshore wind and the failure to implement nuclear. Um, what is the current state of wind in Britain? What is the current state of other energy plans?
Yeah, so Britain, I think, is the second largest deployer of offshore wind in the world, behind China. Uh, it is playing like a pretty significant role in the electricity mix as of now. I don't have the exact figures. Uh, and you have most of the capital that's being allocated to this is coming from foreign companies. There is no, say, British manufacturing champion in wind turbines. Uh, it's either being deployed by Vestas, which is a Danish manufacturer, or Siemens Gamesa, which is kind of a joint German-Spanish enterprise that's managed by Siemens. They do have manufacturing locations in the UK, but a great deal of the capital is being deployed by foreign companies and foreign utilities like Ørsted, the Danish utility company, which is attempting to develop uh, an offshore wind farm in the latest UK auction. Uh, what has generally been driving the uh, the offshore wind industry has been sort of uh, the very significant declines in levelized cost of energy. And I won't go into this like too much, but essentially this is a commonly used but quite simplistic um, understanding of the true cost of wind energy, which means that it sort of looks artificially cheaper than it is versus gas plants or coal plants or nuclear power plants. Generally, because levelized cost of energy, which is used very widely by financial institutions, it's used particularly by the financial company Lazard, actually does not factor in intermittency or balancing costs for that intermittency. and so it doesn't factor in any wider costs that come to a grid that's dominated by intermittent renewables. Besides that, you have had contracts for difference prices, and essentially these are auction strike prices that wind developers pay for or bet for, and as these auction prices have gone down very significantly, it's created a sense, I think, within the civil service that the cost of wind energy is decreasing markedly. Um, Up until very recently, developers would win on these contracts for difference, say that they were going to pay a certain strike price, but as they were developing the site, and even as they were running it, they delay actually entering the contracts for difference uh, contract, which means that they are effectively charging a great deal more than is being advertised. What's more, these contracts for difference or CFD prices are inflation indexed, which means that their price keeps going up. Uh, so you factor that in, you factor in the renewables obligations, you factor in the balancing costs, and essentially the true cost of offshore wind is not really being accounted for within the UK civil service. And another reason why it's been prioritized, I think, is because UK planning laws have effectively um, made onshore wind, onshore solar, and even onshore nuclear and gas development very easy to disrupt. Right? UK discovered quite large deposits of shale gas in Lancashire around 2014. By 2019, there was a moratorium on any fracking development. Uh, it was effectively sort of like verboten to develop it. And the UK is not exceptional in that. Across uh, pretty much all of Europe, while the potential for shale gas is far less than in the United States, Germany, France, um, Hungary, these are all countries with interesting prospective reserves of shale gas, uh, but they've effectively been ruled verboten to develop because of moratoriums done um, generally under the premise that solar and wind power are going to be powering Europe um, in the very near term, and so there's no real need for additional oil and gas development. Needless to say, this is not what's been going on in the United States.
Yeah, and reflecting on some of your Substack posts, which I encourage any listeners to check out. It's ryancwhitton.substack.com. And you talk about the British mining industry and further downstream processes. And can you talk about the relationship between energy and these very hard industries of mining and manufacturing that kind of goes in that adjacent sector?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it seems almost like a truism that, like, if you kind of want to envisage like having a dynamic, like, industrial sector, cheap energy is sort of a must, right? Um, this is kind of it depends very much on the activity that's being conducted, right? So for like primary resource extraction, certainly something like mining, energy costs are going to be a very significant part of overall costs. If you're looking at something like refining these like crude materials into uh, inputs for general industrial goods, right? Whether that's the chemical industry, whether it's the mineral refining industry for something like lithium, then the cost of energy is going to be pretty determinative in terms of like where that refinery is placed. So Britain, for example, is actually going to start mining lithium in Cornwall. Lithium is one of these sort of like interesting commodities where the price is going to just like keep increasing because the demand is so enormous. Uh, but the likelihood of us being able to refine that lithium in the UK is very sketchy. And well, lithium refining is heavily dominated by the Chinese, which, through a variety of mechanisms, both energy abundance but also lots of subsidies, has very competitive energy prices. Uh, I think steel is probably like the biggest case in point in which like very high energy prices basically make British steel production impossible without subsidies. Um, it's sometimes related to renewable obligations cost. Steel is obviously a carbon intensive process, even if you're generally using electric arc furnaces, because the electricity that's being used is being supplied by gas plants or by coal plants. And then there's the network costs that are related to it as well because of the presence of intermittent renewables. So British steel production is not merely uncompetitive at the global scale, but at the local scale as well. Um, and because of our feed-in tariff, well, because of our renewables obligation regime, uh, it will actually be taxed to a greater degree in many cases than imported steel. So, like, I think very interesting. Britain had a deal with, well, they had, Britain has subsidized its steel industry in various ways. One way has been through using tariffs for certain steel producers that they consider, carbon intensive. Ukraine is one of the most carbon intensive steel producers because they use very old fashioned open hearth processes. Uh, but Britain, in part, I think, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, actually uh, took down its tariffs and exempted Ukraine from these tariffs, which means that incredibly carbon intensive Ukrainian steel has entered the UK market and is actually taxed to a far lower degree than domestically produced steel. And so you have just some terrible financial dynamics in place, which make the entire industry at the mercy of government subsidies. Now, British steel production is generally monopolized by, I think, like uh, Liberty Global, which is a British company run by a British Indian uh, uh, sort of plutocrat, uh, and it's also run in part by Tata Steel, which is an Indian steel producer, and then you have British Steel, which is owned by Jingye Steel Group, which is a Chinese steel conglomerate. So, out of those three stakeholders, there's very little connection or alignment with the interests like of the British electorate, or even with the places in which those steel foundries are placed. Uh, for their part, you know, they're kind of in the subsidies business as opposed to the profitability business. They understand the political difficulties of the government letting these steel plants flounder, and so in many cases they're actively, in some weird way bribing the government to provide additional subsidies, sort of far in excess of what their actual losses are, because otherwise they're threatening to simply shut down operations altogether. Um, and you have very strange dynamics where all three producers and major British steel associations essentially argue that British steel can be made entirely carbon neutral, either through the use of electric arc furnaces or through hydrogen-based steel production. Needless to say, if you're doing that, those processes are far more electricity intensive than using coking coal and traditional sort of oxygen-based steel production. That would obviously mean you're having to buy a lot of expensive electricity, right? So the problems compound on each other, and what you essentially have is an industry that can never be competitive because UK electricity costs are so high, and that can never be put out of its misery because the government can't really accept the political fallout. And even if it did, it would probably cost more to decommission these plants and then deal with the resulting cleanup. So it's a very miserable situation, and it kind of exists as a signifier for lots of other like British industries which are really held back um, by a very ineffective energy grid.
And so, do you think that the trajectory which you allude to, which is, there's not going to be a steel industry unless it is heavily subsidized in Britain, or that these downstream industries in manufacturing will follow along in that trend. Uh, do you think that's there's an awareness of that, whether it's in the policymaking circles or the people that advocate these things or the general British public, that there's a lot more that you lose than just your carbon intensity perhaps going down by staking a course like this?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think the British public seem pretty sincere in their kind of belief in that there is this massive windfall of green jobs coming over the horizon. Um, there's obviously some sort of opposition, like in the recesses of the Telegraph, and certainly in what's left of the British oil and gas industry. But the wider public does seem to believe that you can basically promote like green jobs via more sort of gigafactories plus more wind power plus more solar panel. But at the level of policymakers, there is an understanding that these energy costs are hurting wider industry pretty heavily. And so they are beginning to deploy a lot of exemptions, but then they have to negotiate, right, with the Treasury, which wants to get all this renewable obligation money in, right, to fund, the wider problems of the state. You've got to factor in that Britain is a net debtor, right, and has a growing trade deficit. Not to mention, the fact that borrowing costs are beginning to go up and are not likely to come down anytime soon. So you kind of have an understanding that British industry is not particularly competitive, but there is no sort of understanding that this is somehow being caused by what's counted as British industrial strategy for the last 10 to 20 years, right? The sort of massive expansion in offshore wind has clearly played a role in increasing energy prices. The failure to build nuclear, the failure to extract oil and gas, the failure to develop gas storage systems. This has all played a very significant factor in making Britain an incredibly uncompetitive place to manufacture. Um, but the solutions generally amount to exemptions, which, of course, in many cases just create more busy work. So I think the Tories have a residual understanding of these problems, at least at the, you know, there'll be policymakers and special advisors who kind of understand these problems, but they're sort of on their way out. So their ability to actually affect change is pretty minimal. Labour, while there will be some people who maybe have thought about this, and there are certainly union members who are very against, putting effective bans on oil and gas production or stopping new exploration in the North Sea. The majority of policy in Labour does seem tilted towards doubling down on the Green New Deal and green industrial strategy, right? Um, I mean, they certainly see Biden in the US as a template for what you can do in the UK. Um, I think that's, in my view, mistaken. You know, I think you've perhaps written on just the level of subsidies that are going towards battery factories to electric vehicle factories to uh, you know wind power in the US to solar power. Um, this is being matched by subsidies in Europe, but also in Asia as well. And if the UK tries to join what is a very saturated, highly subsidized industrial policy that's being done by multiple countries, I don't really see why Britain would have any reason to come out on top in that. Um, so I don't think there's a tremendous understanding of the problems. Um, you know, this is kind of sort of I think energy abundance or very cheap energy is not necessarily on the political radar.
Yeah, interesting. So, do you want to get in then to more of like the global push for green industrialization? And this seems to be an interesting turn where some of the criticisms of net zero policies and sort of unspecified caps on traditional energy kind of glosses over, and the green industrialists are kind of coming in and trying to fix some of those problems with their own versions. So while there is a element to the green industrial movement, which is they're prioritizing industry, they are seeking to give it subsidy and trying to close gaps in energy production where they can, and thinking about it that way. From your perspective, what does it get right? What does it get wrong?
Yeah, no. So I mean, we're talking about like an incredibly diverse like range of like policies and technologies here, which all get sort of thrown under the label green, right? And it's like when you're color coding industry, I think to to sort of ease the minds of policymakers who are supposed to sort of like push this stuff through parliaments or so forth. I think that that's like just an overly simplistic term. Um, I don't know what you think about the term green, but it often obscures a lot more than it kind of reveals about like what's going on, and is used as kind of it's used in too lazy a way, I think, and it doesn't often catch like often what's being invested in. Certainly, like
Yeah,
for the
just to cut in quickly.
yeah.
So just an example in the U.S. Recently, Biden, through the U.S. Department of Energy, loaned Ford 9.2 billion, um, or they loaned 9.2 billion to Blue Oval for the construction of 3 manufacturing plants to produce batteries for Ford for future electric vehicles.
Mm.
And so that's when I say green, I'm speaking to that kind of specified large subsidy and investment into things like electric vehicles, batteries, wind turbines, solar panels, the adjacent inputs that go around with them.
Yeah, so batteries and batteries and EVs are sort of a very interesting one. I mean, the fallout there will be, I think, pretty momentous. There's no doubt that, like, you know, to be a good battery developer, you've essentially got to have very low energy costs and got to be, willing to pollute a little. And I think this is why um, battery development is so monopolized by East Asian companies, right? Like Chinese Catal, Panasonic in Japan, SK Hynix and LG and Samsung in South Korea. Um, while a lot of their business is not necessarily done in Korea or Japan, which interestingly, Japanese and Korean car companies are actually well behind in development of electric vehicles, these battery developers are partnering with American and German automotive companies, and generally doing like a lot of battery cell development and production on site. So this is like the relationship that Panasonic has with Tesla, even if Tesla also has attempts to build its own battery making capacity in Texas. There's no doubt, I think, that you know the US stands potentially to benefit. You know, post electrification around 2040, the US car industry could be much better placed then than it is now relative to other automotive industries. It, as far as I can see, is taking far less of a slice of the automotive market than China is. Part of that is just the demographic dynamics. China is a much bigger automotive market and is becoming bigger. But it does seem that American car companies are becoming more competitive via electrification than their European counterparts. And I think that the gap in, say, battery efficiency on a Tesla vehicle versus a Mercedes electric vehicle is pretty significant. And I think the real question there is, what does that do for Germany, right? The automotive industry is, anywhere between 30% and half of German R&D spending. It's the single like biggest industry, is responsible for almost 10% of GDP if you factor in the wider supply chain. Even if German EVs turn out to be competitive, that transition from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles will mean, a much more simplified supply chain because internal combustion engines are just more complicated than battery packs. Right? They have much more inputs and they have much more individual parts, sometimes like 10 times as many. So it's quite possible that electrification will be very good for China, very good for the United States, but actually uh, for major European economies could be actually quite damaging and could have like pretty serious political ramifications. With Germany being sort of the case in point. That's kind of my sort of initial view, at least on EVs and batteries.
Yeah. What do you make of the rise of Chinese electric vehicles on a global market? I think we've seen a number of articles that have come out in the past few months that talk about, especially in the European market, Chinese vehicles are starting to get a significant share. Um, do you think anyone really expected that? And what does the Chinese electric vehicle producers hold for the future of the global, EV industry?
Yeah, so it's not something that I've looked at too much besides perceiving this massive increase in exports for not just like uh, autos made in China, but actually Chinese autos. I think, you'd have to be incredibly bullish on the industry. The fact that Elon Musk is so glowing in his views of China is, I'm sure partly just trying to get business done there. But I think that he clearly is reticent about a US-China Cold War and doesn't want to, uh, you lead it in a sense. He's not sort of looking for US subsidies on the basis that I'm an American company and I'm going to help you sort of compete with the Chinese. I think, you know, it's not necessarily the electric vehicles themselves which are the end point. Um, an EV chassis is probably not much more complicated than an I chassis. There are, of course, innovations like cell to chassis, which are potentially interesting, but the battery pack development is where I think the Chinese advantage really comes into play, and you're actually seeing like Cattle CATL, the sort of very large lithium-ion battery developer in China, actually get a lot of business in the United States as well. So, as I understand it, Ford has actually reneged on taking these easy tax credits from partnering with South Korean and Japanese battery developers, and instead is going to be licensing technology off Cattle, which I think kind of highlights that this is not just uh, sort of a company built on Chinese subsidies, but is actually pretty competitive on the global stage as well. Um, Europe has, I think, traditionally been less reticent about its trade deficit with China than the US has, as far as I can tell. Right? There might be some pushback that you can give on that, but if the Chinese trade surplus with Europe and particularly with Germany um, exacerbates any further, and it's already increased markedly in just 2 or 3 years since the pandemic, then might you start to see some of the dynamics of kind of the anti-China US trade hawks seen in Europe? That's a bit more speculative, but I think it's a growing possibility.
Yeah, Europe, I mean, and also Europe is not a single entity,
Of
especially
course.
when, considering I think UK has a friendlier relationship with China, and depending on how you're looking at it, the Europeans do want a friendly relationship with China, maybe more so than the US, but then it cuts across. A lot of them are protectionist at the end of the day. So
Well,
it
yeah,
is a confusing story.
sorry, UK attitude to China is sort of explicitly more bellicose.
Yeah.
we're sort of, I don't think there's any European that's even remotely interested in sending military assets to the South China Sea or to Southeast Asia or Australia for policing the high seas or anything like that. I don't, uh, I guess the French were trying to beat the British to a submarine deal with Australia, but they were eased out of that by AUKUS. But when it comes to trade, the UK, I don't think has a particularly strong hand versus China. The trade deficit with China now is approaching something like 2.5% of UK GDP. You could try and become more protectionist on that, but I think the problem is the UK is just too reliant on various like inputs for its manufacturing base. Right? If you were to increase protectionist policy in the UK, you wouldn't really be helping British suppliers because really too much of our manufacturing is tilted towards the assembly of parts made elsewhere. So it's almost to the point now where even protectionist policies, which would potentially be good in a country like the US, or at least be something that the US market can tolerate, would be far more challenging for the UK.
Yeah, I see. Returning to Tesla, Musk, and China, um, do you this is a view I've also like kind of quibbled about, but do you think that eventually the Chinese will force Tesla out? The way that I've read why they've accepted Tesla in is that they are actually implementing some form of competition on their domestic EV companies. And the idea is once they use that competition to get better and whatever other under the table, intellectual property transfers and labor shifts from the Tesla factory to the other factories and transferring that skill set of knowledge. Do you think that is a when, not an if, for Tesla and Musk in China?
Yeah, no, interesting. Well, it certainly wouldn't be the first time, right? So, like, I mean, as we've seen, certainly, I mean, the solar industry worked on those premises as well, right? So China dominates the entire solar supply chain, but a lot of that was taking, you know, a lot of it was taken by a very prominent Chinese student going to an Australian university, learning under an Australian technologist, and then relying on German consultants and German companies to gain expertise, by which point you kind of build up your own
Mhm.
heavily subsidized solar industry. And just by virtue of China's critical mass and the kind of very effective subsidy regime that it has, it's obviously very wasteful in certain instances, but it's effective at taking market share in industry, right? Like that's the fundamental basis for industrial competition. Uh, the question is, can Tesla continue to evolve and differentiate itself to the point where it can't just be copied by China? Um, you know, if the development of Tesla really is just right, can we economize on the number of cells, on the number of modules, uh, on the number of battery tracks, on its configuration within the chassis? Like, can we, put cells within the skeleton of the car to make the vehicle lighter? Can we make it more efficient? Can we make the miles go faster? If it really is just, a case of optimizing an electric vehicle, which already performs quite well relative to internal combustion engine based systems already, then it's hard to sort of see how the Chinese won't catch up with it. I mean, as far as I can tell, BYD is already perfectly perfectly viable in European markets. It doesn't have the sexiness of a Tesla yet. Um, the brand of a Tesla, does have some inherent value, but uh, I think, I would certainly agree with you. It's a when, not if situation. Now, Tesla does have some proprietary technology when it comes to the production phase, right? If Tesla can license its production methods in some way, that's potentially interesting source of revenue. Tesla obviously is trying to push forward self-driving with varying degrees of success, and is uh, generally being seen within that wider community as a bit of an outlier versus, Waymo and Aurora Innovation and those kinds of players. Um, but that's potentially another point of differentiation. Another thing Tesla is looking to do is, well, develop those humanoid robots. Now, that kind of gets like a lot of kind of attention and is perceived as somewhat like of a joke, because the actual prototype looks so much worse than the advertised simulated, robot that they kind of envision. But what I think that essentially is uh, a research organization within the company focused on improving drives and gearboxes, right? And essentially making them more efficient, lighter. Now that can be applied to robots. It can maybe also be applied to vehicles as well. So there are a number of ways in which Tesla can try and you know diversify itself or innovate its way out of playing like a game of attrition with Chinese auto players. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to gauge what Musk feels about the situation, but if Tesla gets to keep 3% of the Chinese market, does it really matter if the wider EV industry becomes Chinese? That's the question, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, it's up there. Yeah, I just view it as what discernible reason would the Chinese have to keep Tesla? Like the death nail of Tesla, in my opinion, would be if they were to somehow lose that gigafactory in Shanghai. I don't know how a traumatic government intervention from the Chinese to sort of like halt production or like confiscate that factory, or whatever they could do there, would not be a massive blow in terms of the investment that Musk has done in Shanghai and like the loss of future production that would come out of it. So yeah, I don't see a discernible reason why the Chinese wouldn't do that eventually. And then from more of a U.S. perspective, and whoever else that Musk will have ties with in terms of the aerospace industry with his other company,
Hmm.
what is the incentive structure from the U.S. to allow Musk to continue operating in Shanghai, given that he is privy to like top secret Defense Department intelligence?
Well, yeah, but Tesla and SpaceX are separate companies, right? So, like, I mean, I think the US has it's a difficult sell to tell not just Tesla, but it's companies in general that they have to renege on business with China, right? I think, I mean, it's not just Tesla, right, that's still cooperating sort of, with Chinese officials. I mean, Ford is doing it via this partnership with Cattle as well. Um, yeah, that's going to be a very tricky dynamic, isn't it? Like between the U.S. corporate world and the U.S. government. Um, I mean, you might know better than me on sort of like you know, like will American sort of manufacturers be able to essentially pull out of the Chinese market? And when I say manufacturers, I include offshorers like Apple. Like I know Apple say they have plans to divest from China, but like these contingency plans? Is this like diversification for certain products? It feels to me that like the, many like US companies, Apple being like a case in point, really would rather stay in the Chinese supply chain and work with Foxconn, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think with Apple that's especially the case. Though with Apple, they did do plans with India to move some production. Um, but I think in general, from the policymaker perspective, from the corporate world's perspective, there is a very, very slow moving consensus on, uh, whatever you want to say about China, they hit the middle income trap. And where there are low wages for manufacturing are Vietnam, India, Philippines, Indonesia, Mexico. And so that is happen like that trend will happen, but China is just so big and so intrinsic to how the global economy has worked that I don't think that's as visible. but take it for like Biden with the semiconductor policy so far. Like he flat out did a very uh, probably unthinkable policy like 5 years ago, which even with Trump in office, which is he banned like anybody in the semiconductor sector from like working in China, working for Chinese companies, and he said they have to come back to the U.S. So we actually saw that already there, and it's just a question of like how far does that extend? How much more are American companies going to be kind of whipped into shape, to not be doing business with a rival? I think the folks at American Compass, the think tank in DC that is talking about a lot of protectionist policies, they're very vocal about the idea of the government needs to come in and really direct American companies out of China and protect intellectual property better. And if there are subsidies given by the American government, there's going to be conditions on how that money is spent, and if it does end up helping China. That's one of the criticisms of the CHIPS Act, is that there's too much circulation of that subsidy back into helping the Chinese.
Yeah, that's a noteworthy point, and that was changed, right? So that went through like the lobbying like phase where essentially, a lot of the chip companies and chip designers, got a hell of a lot of subsidies and got a lot of the restrictions around investment in China kind of earmarked out of the bill. Uh, yeah, I mean, at the moment, it seems that like the US position on China and chips is like, well, we'll let our developers sell chips of a certain standard to the Chinese, so the market isn't entirely crushed. But for the most advanced generation of chips, there's going to be severe restrictions, and that seems like the case with like Nvidia and so forth. And that can be maintained as long as China doesn't have access to very niche technology like extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that are supplied by ASML, or at least the latest generation of EUV machines. And while you can't stop the Chinese semiconductor market, you can maybe at least hobble it so that the US chip industry remains ahead by 1 or 2 generations at the maximum. That's going to be an interesting, dynamic. Like, how can that be maintained? It's going to be very tricky. Um, Undoubtedly, I mean, look, the US domination of intellectual property for the highest end chips is, a real source of strength for them. Um, the manufacturing side of chips in the US, I think, is more like contentious. Intel really isn't particularly competitive with TSMC for that top line of chips. And I noticed with TSMC's current construction project in the United States, today TSMC said they were bringing over migrant workers to help with that construction because they were very dissatisfied with the the American workforce. So that will be interesting to see, like how TSMC functions within the US economy versus in Taiwan and so forth.
Yeah, it is an interesting problem. From that perspective, another criticism of the CHIPS Act is that it does really nothing for the workforce, and how the legacy of deindustrialization, or you have a debate about if America really is deindustrialized, but to the degree of like the Rust Belt narrative of that deindustrialization, the skills and the labor force needed to actually have that renaissance in semiconductors is not in the US, and there's no discerning idea of like where that is going to come from outside of a few kind of lackluster efforts. And yeah, and within the construction project in for the Taiwanese semiconductors, one of the things that you're noticing too is like there's a lot of residential going up next to the plant, and so like they're bringing in the foreign Taiwanese workers over the Americans. And what's interesting too is if geographically in Arizona, there are Intel plants in Chandler, Arizona, which is in the southeast of the Phoenix metro. the Taiwanese plant is like way in the northwest. And so like these are industrial kind of clusters that are separated, which is sort of just an interesting thing to think about to some degree, even though it's the same metro. So on that point, like, what do you think about the pipeline of labor force, of skills training, and how that will shape the Taiwanese future in America, and what that says about policy in general?
Sorry about the importation of Taiwanese workers to the US, or um,
Yeah, just sort of like thinking about it from like a workforce perspective. Like, how will the Taiwanese just sort of bring their workers in and like retain workers in the factory? Will there be Americans that eventually can come in, or will America just drop the ball and actually creating a pipeline of sufficient workers?
yeah, I mean, I mean, the US like position on like skills gaps has generally been to sort of increase immigration, right? Like kind of since 1965, like at least, right? Like I mean, it's a fairly lax sort of like immigration regime, and to the point it's restrictive. It the Canadians try to take the rest, right? Like in terms of like H-1B visas, uh, and so forth. Uh, yeah, upskilling the American workforce would mean sort of like a real interrogation of American educational institutions, uh, which would be, really difficult, like, and would be also politically costly. So there is kind of a beautiful simplicity to just importing very capable sort of Taiwanese workers. It probably won't benefit the area, and you'll see sort of, a lot of the pathologies of, you know, um, the American labor force sort of continue to manifest. But in terms of getting stuff built, it might accelerate the process to bring over Taiwanese migrant workers. Um, yeah, I mean the biases of the U.S. system do seem geared towards bringing people in um, for this kind of thing, whether it's sort of bringing in like a very large number of sort of Indian migrant workers for kind of mid-end sort of like computer and IT support to Taiwanese specialists for bringing in like chip manufacturing. Uh, that's probably my bias. Yeah, like I mean, speaking of my own country, the UK, like the uh, average age of an engineer is sort of well into the 50s. If you go more specialized to, you know, mining engineers, it's, people like on average over like 60. Uh, and there's very little plan in place to replace these with sort of the members of the domestic workforce. Um, it's all being tilted towards, an excuse for more immigration, which generally is not actually plugging the holes and actually, making the workforce more competitive. Um, but it's being used as an alibi for that. That's at least the way I see it. But look, I mean, America is, it is a nation, but it is also at this stage an empire, and uh, it, will be using the workforces of Taiwan and Japan and South Korea, to try and further reindustrialize itself.
Yeah, and so jumping then from semiconductors, the U.S. CHIPS Act, you've written on the comparison to what the UK is trying to do. So, can you talk about the UK specifically and their reaction to this push for things like the CHIPS Act in the United States and other versions of that in like the EU?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it seems, and I think this is like one of the big problems with industrial policy, like these days, is like every industrial policy, like sort of pre like 1970s. Like if you're thinking about the German industrial policy, Korea's, Japan's, uh, the American system of industrial policy, the sort of implicit British system of industrial policy, in the 1800s and so forth. These weren't like kind of manifestos or like policy papers, right? They weren't like a series of like discrete things that you could sort of try to do based around like the next five key technologies. They were like a unique political economy to that country. And I think that there's a real danger that industrial policy basically becomes like this sort of subset of things that every government tries to do, and it all just relates to the same technologies, and that takes very little account of the actual strengths of the host country or what makes it potentially competitive. Not just that, but if everyone is sort of engaging in industrial policy related to a select few technologies, there really can only be a certain number of winners, especially for something as capital intensive as chips, right? There's like what three or four major foundries in the world. There's one major foundry that develops the like highest quality chips. So the UK, for reasons that we previously talked about, is already in a very uncompetitive place when it comes to chip manufacturing anyway. I've talked to people like from the Green Party and so forth who support, reducing carbon emissions and energy consumption, but also support like developing like like semiconductor fabs in Cornwall or whatever. It's like that there's no appreciation of how energy intensive they are. And so, in some sense, the British semiconductor strategy, which is like a pittance, like 1 or 2 billion, like mostly directed towards research and a few tax credits for small companies related to very niche parts of the market. It's an implicit surrender. It's basically saying that we're not going to be a big player in this space. And so I think for a lot of people and for a lot of industrial professionals, it was very disappointing. Um, and it is quite a shame that like this won't be. It's not like we're going to have very limited funding on this so that we can spend the money heavily in another sector like chemicals or aerospace. It's more that like the money will just go to the the triple lock pensions, um, and that's obviously quite disappointing. But I talked to or rather read a report by a very prominent British researcher called Professor Richard Jones, and he knows pretty much everything about the British semiconductor space. And yet, the only real discrete policy that he could really come up with was renationalizing ARM, which is the major architecture designer, which doesn't design the chips, but designs the architecture on which the chips are built on. Now, ARM, has a very fabled history. It's Cambridge based. It was bought by SoftBank in 2016, and now Nvidia tried to buy it, but was stopped from doing so by various antitrust organizations. And now it's going to be floated on the Nasdaq as opposed to the London Stock Exchange. And so it is, to all intents and purposes, now a transatlantic, American company. Uh, and the idea of some semiconductor people is that Britain could, try and get a golden stake in ARM, like 25%, could force it back onto the London Stock Exchange, could renationalize it, and that would cost, well in excess of 50 billion if you were to take control of it. But you could potentially, recoup the money through the licenses that ARM gets every year, which are currently around, 2.5 to 4 billion like every year. But ultimately, this is putting, ARM in the custodianship of the British state, and I think such a venture, like it it probably repels a lot of conservatives who think that like the British state having anything to do with such a complex organization would just be bad. And I'm tempted to agree with them, but I think that in itself is also an admission of defeat because you kind of don't really believe the state can be useful in anything. Anyway, with the kind of nationalization of ARM taken off the table, there isn't necessarily a great deal for Britain to do for semiconductors other than some very mild research. Um, Unfortunately, that's kind of the the place we are in.
Yeah, it's a rock and a hard place, and I think where some people end up saying is, it's better to have a mediocre industrial, kind of sector or giant company than none at all. It's sort of like, it's the often conservative argument is talking about like perfection, where it doesn't exactly need to be the case for the benefits that you're deriving from it. So that's an interesting example to look into. Um, so then I would say, to move on, where do you think are the key lessons for, you could specify for the UK or just general policymakers, people that are thinking about economic industrial policy, um, for the next 10 years, 20 years, as we approach this sort of the rise of the semiconductor rivalries, the push for EVs, and whatever comes next?
Oof, it's a difficult one. I suppose like the primary thing I would say is that like energy abundance and cheap energy sort of is a veto on any discrete industrial policy. I think like at that, you kind of have, I think, across the West, three meta issues or crises. One is housing, right? Two is demographics and aging, and three is energy. And I think like if you were able to get those three things right, all the complex discrete policies would take care of themselves. But energy, or the challenges, uh, particularly around like the UK like electricity sector, um, essentially uh, prohibit any industrial policy from actually being successful. You can, to an extent, be a heavily industrialized country and still have high electricity prices, like Germany is at the moment, although that's going to be a much bigger problem for them over the next 10 years. But I, I think if you've suffered a great deal of deindustrialization, aren't particularly competitive across a range of industries, and have very high electricity prices, I think you can see across every sector you're going to be uncompetitive. Uh, One thing I did look at recently was industrial electricity prices versus like robot density. So the countries that had the highest electricity prices also had the fewest robots in the manufacturing workforce, Britain being the case in point. Whereas countries with very reliable, cheap industrial electricity, like South Korea, weirdly like Singapore, uh, actually had a much greater level of density. Now, like South Korea and Singapore import a lot of their energy, but the fact is it's gas, and they work very hard to make sure it's secure. So this is a problem that's very fixable, but I think that it's the ultimate like problem that from which all other questions of like wider industrial policy flow from.
Yeah, that's a great statistic that you brought up. When I first saw it in your writing, it really was an eye opener of thinking about it that way. Um, yeah, so then I think I also wanted to ask quickly, even though it could be a rabbit hole, um, just quickly, like, how does monetary policy affect industrial policy? We don't have to go down super long into it, but I think that would be an interesting to hear your perspective on that.
Oh, oof, monetary policy, the industrial policy. Uh, in reference to what? I'm clutching at straws here. Yeah, well, maybe not industrial policy, but you would know this better than me. Like, at least in the case of robotics, we had a huge amount of funding from like 2015 to 2021, right, and a massive slew of new companies. Um, and their valuations increased markedly, but very often like they weren't very profitable. They weren't like very functional as institutions. Um, and a lot of that funding like has significantly dried up, like essentially because of the rise in interest rates and because the market's gone terrible. Um, so this does like it does seem that like you know industrial automation has gone through a cycle of excess investment, and maybe for the next 2 or 3 years will become a casualty of this very sharp upward trend in interest rates. um yeah like uh do you have any sort of like areas that you sort of uh, or any opinions on monetary policy for industrial policy? It seems that the the current trend is that it will become potentially more constrained, certainly for the UK.
Yeah, there's certainly that element of it when you think about the investment. What I was dwelling on was a little bit of like how monetary policy determines the value of your currency, and then the relative value of your currency determines how competitive you are in terms of doing manufacturing, especially with wage levels. So from that perspective, in the Western economies, the problem is that wages are too high to do manufacturing, which is often suggested. This is why they need to be offshored and put elsewhere. So does monetary policy have a role in artificially reducing the value of a currency that could stimulate manufacturing activity?
Yeah, the problem is in the UK, I think for a variety of I mean because our trade deficit is chronic, uh, the country's finances are ultimately held up by large capital inflows into our finance sector, um, which ultimately relies on a strong sterling, right? So as we saw, I think with Liz Truss, you had essentially a smattering of fairly ill thought out, but ultimately quite small scale tax changes. For a variety of reasons, this led to a sort of sharp loss of confidence in pound sterling. You had sort of a projected increase in borrowing costs. Suddenly, what looked like some very innocuous tax cuts, which ultimately were a bit of a giveaway to the super rich, but weren't really targeting uh, commercial sectors too much. Suddenly becomes this existential event for the Bank of England, or so it at least claims. And what I think it showed is that the UK is ultimately becoming very much like Italy. Italy, from the 1980s, did become very much indebted, uh, and after a period of serious economic turmoil, has for a very long period of time actually been quite financially constrained. Essentially government by bond market. Italy is obviously more constrained than the UK because of its membership of the euro, but I think what the Truss episode maybe showed in Britain is that we are entering that period as well, where you essentially cannot do discrete, innovative, or dynamic state intervention unless it completely factors in market responses, and is very much tied to that. Um, you can see this perhaps like in you know the gap between, say, the book value of loans from major British banks and what they're valued at the market, right? So, in the US, these two measures are largely in sync because the US financial sector or the US economy, for whatever reason, is confident about its banks. That might not be the case anymore, depending on how fast things are moving. But in the UK, the markets massively sort of undervalue UK book loans versus sort of what they say they have on their books, right? And so I think in that environment, industrial policy becomes very constrained, right? You see with Labour, and they propose say 28 billion in clean energy investment. Now we talked about sort of the pitfalls of clean energy, but ultimately 28 billion, over like a potentially 3 5 year period is not a significant ginormous industrial policy, and yet they've already wrote back on it, and that will partially be worrying about the conservative response in the media, but it's also likely that this is sort of being opposed, at the level of the Treasury and you know people in the civil service who want to take a much more sort of anemic view on investment. And so when I think about monetary policy and industrial policy in the UK, what I'm not seeing is a particularly large number of options. I see almost sort of no interest in people to engage in sort of currency alteration or accept a lower pound sterling valuation. What I see is essentially a constraining of options and a shutting of doors and basically an acceptance that we are sort of moving to a kind of managed stagnation model. So that's perhaps the alarming thing, and maybe that's the thing for me to focus on long term. How might you actually use monetary policy for something other than that model?
Interesting, interesting. So, I'm picturing the city of London with a albatross of a country around it. Is the model that
Yeah,
is happening. I do like the Italian phrase you had of government by bond market. That's definitely something to dwell on too.
yeah. Well, it's not original, but I think it is accurate.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so then to conclude, any other points that you want to get across? Any other projects that you're working on that you want to share?
No, not too much. I mean, so uh, Bismarck has been sort of, sort of that's been my primary area of research, and I'm generally writing on anything related to industry, anything related to energy. We have a series of briefs that are focused on the various nuclear industries of different countries, um, and I think, we are seeing in Europe a very significant tilt towards nuclear. Sweden, the Netherlands, France, you know, countries that did have, some uh, retreat of nuclear for the last 10 or 15 years have very quickly swung back. And it does seem that momentum is picking up on that. And so I think nuclear industries, which are generally always centralized in state corporations, um, are going to become relatively more important going forward. Um, I would also, if obviously we haven't talked about Russia at all, but if there's a, you know, Russia is known for incompetence, but there is one corporation within the country that does show some competence, and it is Rosatom, which is its state nuclear agency, which obviously builds, constructs, and manages all the nuclear plants. Besides that, they actually manage the Arctic sea route for their oil developments there, which is not something you generally expect of a nuclear industry developer. Uh, and they also manage a lot of Russia's closed cities, so they're actually very well acquainted with vote rigging. And so, if we're thinking about, a post-Putin Russia and this kind of chaotic warlordism as displayed by Prigozhin, wouldn't be surprised if Rosatom, this sort of weird kind of uh, sanctuary of technocratic elites in Russia, might have some disproportionate power. So that's an interesting thing to consider. I think for my work on Doctor Syn, I am certainly hoping to do a lot more of it, and I think, the next stage is really, you know we can prescribe problems and we can point to certain interesting technologies as solutions, but I'd really be interested in, procuring papers that go some way to actually implementing what we've been talking about as actual legislation. Because increasingly, I think in countries like Ireland and the UK, having lots of think tanks do lots of white papers doesn't really cut it anymore, because very often this cannot get translated into legislation, either because the civil service isn't particularly interested in doing so, or because it actually, in some cases, can't. So, yeah, draft legislation of sorts. I think that would be a long-term ideal of mine.
Great. Yeah. Interesting prognosis on Russia, and definitely a call to action for the sort of circulating thinkers that are coming up with these ideas to really get into the where the rubber hits the road on legislation. So yeah, so please, everyone that's listening, check out Ryan's Substack, Doctor Syn, ryancwhitton.substack.com. Follow him on Twitter. Check out what Bismarck is doing as well. And thank you, Ryan, for coming on.
Thank you, Peter. Enjoyed it a lot.